Okay, hello everyone. It's great to be back at the Boulder Jaipur Literary Festival, and I'm really honored to have Mohit in conversation with me today, one of the forces behind this amazing series of events, which is the Jaipur Literary Festival. So rather than dive right into our discussion, Mohit suggested I spend a few minutes, maybe about 25 minutes, talking about the book and what it's sort of aiming to accomplish. So I'm afraid, me being a professor, you're in for a little bit of a lecture, but it's not going to last too long. So what I want us to think about today is the West. This isn't a class, so I'm not going to ask you directly, but maybe everyone pause for just a minute or two and think about where you would situate the West versus the East, historically, culturally, and especially religiously. Think about the West we live in and its historical origins. So just take a minute and hold that thought. We hear a lot about West versus East these days in the news, mostly unfortunately, and a lot of pundits and politicians talk about Christian values as defining the West and about Judeo-Christian civilization. So what do we think of when we imagine the West? Essentially, the Christian-dominated cultures and societies of the Anglo-European world, of the values this culture supposedly embodies, and how that distinguishes it from other cultures and societies that we imagine often as being incompatibly different. And where did this Western civilization come from? Well, ask most people, especially someone like J.D. Vance, and they'll say that it originated with the Greeks, democracy and scholarship, and then the Romans, empire and technology, and then was transformed by Christianity, morality, salvation, before sinking into the Dark Ages. Then, according to some, in the 1400s, some Italian book collector found a 1500-year-old Latin poem that no one remembered, and suddenly we rediscovered the Romans, and this rocketed us into the Renaissance, in which European Christians, well, not so much Jews, because Christians didn't really like them at that point, set us on our righteous and inevitable course through the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and finally to the world of Facebook, X, and ChatGTP. So manifest destiny, progress, And until 1492, not a person of color in sight. Actually, perhaps not till 1962, or maybe even 2002. Oh, I forgot about one thing. Speaking of color, there was another religious culture that emerged in this context, which was Islam, which was presented, or is presented in this master narrative, often as the implacable enemy to Christianity and Judaism. Born by the Arabs, who are often depicted as a barbaric and violent race, who defiled the holy city of Jerusalem, attacked and afflicted the world with their holy war and their implacable thirst for domination. And that's why we had to have the Crusades, to defend ourselves against the aggression of these Christian-hating infidels, who remain in the popular imagination the mirror image of our West, essentially different, diametrically opposed, and wholly foreign to our values, ideas, and traditions. Really. Well, actually, I want to go back just one second to this persistent fetishization of ancient Rome as the root of European culture. Okay? It really kind of bothers me. First of all, Roman statues didn't look like this. They actually looked like this. So ancient Roman culture was less like this and more like this. It may have looked like this for the 0.1%, but it was like this for the 99%. In fact, if you get right down to it, ancient Rome was fascism before fascism, right down to the destruction of the Jewish temple. So it's not something you necessarily want to be proud about if you think about it. So now I'll ask you a question, or rather three questions, and to raise your hand at the appropriate moment. And in fact, when I ask the questions, I'd like you to try not to look around and see what everyone else is doing, okay? Because I want to get your kind of candid impressions. The game is called Eastern or Western, okay? So, Christianity, Eastern, Western, okay? Judaism, Eastern, Western, okay? Islam, Eastern, Western, okay, interesting. It doesn't really matter what you answered, but think about what you answered, because in point of fact, the three religions all came from the same region, within the same population, growing up basically within the same culture, or similar culture and society, within a few centuries of each other. They came not only from the same region, but associate deeply with the same city. And in fact, they all worship the same God, the God of Abraham, who has the same attributes for all of them: all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, and all-good, although occasionally grumpy. They venerate the same prophets and patriarchs, the same broad narrative of creation and redemption. And except for some minor details, such as was Jesus the Jewish Messiah and the literal Son of God, they're nearly identical. Broadly speaking, they share a very similar theology, a masculine orientation, the same or similar views on morality, sexuality, and so on. So like many related phenomena, they may appear very different on the surface, but in fact, they're not very different at all. And if you look around this room, you can see people who look very different from each other and from ourselves, but in fact, we share 99% of the same genome. So how different are we? Now, of course, this similarity doesn't mean that Christians, Muslims, and Jews always liked each other or were sympathetic to each other. In fact, quite the opposite at many times. Ironically, as human beings, we often find it easier to accept people whose ideas are radically different than our own, while it drives us crazy when people with whom we have a lot in common disagree with us on minor points. We see that as more of a threat. This is what Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences. So you could say that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are different religions, or you could say, in fact, there are three interpretations of the same religion, what we call the Abrahamic faith. Those faiths or religions that look back to Abraham as the first monotheist. Abrahamic faith is one of the essential features, you might say, that has come to define what is the West. And that changes our notion of what the West is. Because if this is the case, the West is not just Christian Europe and its historical outgrowths, but a wider area in which the Abrahamic faiths came to dominate, and which in the pre-modern era stretched not just around Europe, but from the Indus to the Atlantic, and from Central Africa to the north, and which had, in the pre-modern era, the Mediterranean as its epicenter. But theology is only one small part of religion, which is itself a dimension or framework for a larger set of cultural characteristics. And we see historically that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism share more here than they differ also, especially when we look over the long expanse of history and we look at the formative periods of these religions. And this is a little bit of a misnomer. It's difficult to speak of a formative period because religious cultures are constantly evolving. Now, this may surprise many of us because we've been taught that the building blocks of history are distinct and separate nations or distinct and separate cultures. So we tend to see Christianity, Judaism, and Islam interacting as if they're kind of characters in some sort of a historical opera. Christianity does this, Judaism does that, so on and so forth. But this isn't how history works. Whatever civilizations or cultures are, they're made up of collectives and individuals who don't necessarily represent their supposed values, and who themselves are complex and often embody conflicting ideas and agendas, and who don't necessarily follow the supposed dictates of their faith or culture. So socially, culturally, politically, and economically, Muslims, Christians, and Jews have been deeply entangled over the last 1,500 years in deep communication, collaboration, and conflict. And it makes sense to think of the pre-modern history of the Abrahamic West not as having its locus in Europe, but rather in this larger Mediterranean world, where the processes of contact, synthesis, and innovation that made the West took place. So here, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in diverse societies in which collaboration was a key to their success and survival. They lived in the same environment, so they faced the same challenges, ate the same foods, with a few exceptions, spoke the same languages, borrowed each other's alphabets, converted to each other's religions, intermarried, wore the same clothes for the most part, listened to the same music, read the same literature, poetry, science, and theology, heard the same folk tales, and even venerated many of the same saints. At times, they even worshiped together in the same places and spaces. They used the same magic. They were all obsessed with astrology. And they venerated the same scientific and philosophical traditions. So here's a fun one. This is a contemporary representation from the Middle Ages of three individuals considered to be the intellectual giants of the world of medieval Islam, as far as they saw intellectual tradition. Any guesses to who these three might be? Well, I'll tell you. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. How about that? So Christians, Muslims, and Jews had a lot of common ground, and they could borrow from each other almost seamlessly. And because they disagreed on a few fundamental points, in fact, they had to confront, refute, and adopt each other's arguments and knowledge on a continual basis. This meant that although they didn't agree, they had to recognize the value of each other's faith systems and incorporate elements of them into their own cultures and societies. So recognizing the history of the West in these terms requires a kind of radical rethinking of that history. And this is the impetus that brought about this book, The Sea in the Middle, which is a presentation of a new model of history which has been coalescing over the last 3 decades or so. It shows that while Christianity, Judaism, and Islam may have developed as distinct social, cultural, and faith traditions, they did so as a consequence of their intense contact and integration over the course of 1,000 years. And in spite of these differences, they remained intimately connected and interdependent. None of these religions would be what they are today without this deep and ongoing engagement they had with each other. And to give you just an example, in talking about the Renaissance, without the revival of Aristotelian rationalism in the Middle Ages, there would have been no Renaissance, no Enlightenment or scientific revolution, no Protestant Reformation, and so on and so forth. And how did this happen? Well, Muslim thinkers began picking up pagan Aristotle's rationalism from heretical Christian monks in the 9th and 10th centuries who were trying to figure out how to make Aristotelian thought work for Christian theology. And these Muslim thinkers instead applied it to Islamic theology. Now, this was a process that took several centuries and culminated in the work of the philosopher Muhammad ibn Rushd, who's also known as Averroes, a Muslim who lived in Spain in the 1100s and who kind of decoded Aristotle and figured out how to apply it to a monotheistic theological tradition. So his work was read by many Muslims, but it was also read by other people, such as Moses Maimonides, who was a Jewish philosopher also living in Cordoba a little bit later, who wrote mostly in Arabic and who adopted Ibn Rushd's method and applied it to Judaism and ended up writing his revolutionary work, the Mishnah Torah. Christian philosophers then started picking up on this, notably St. Thomas Aquinas, who based his new Catholic theology on Ibn Rushd's approach. So things came full circle. And no one was the least bit bothered by this. Christian theologians praised Ibn Rushd. They called him the commentator because they recognized him as the one who best understood Aristotle. So without this Muslim thinker, Ibn Rushd, neither Judaism nor Christianity would be what they are today theologically. So this has all been pretty abstract, and so now, to get towards the end, I'd like to switch to some specifics. So in the 10 minutes or so I have left, I want to look at a single object produced in this time, in this environment, which reflects some of the trends I've been discussing. So if you go to Paris, you can go to the Louvre, and at the Louvre you'll find this. This is called the Eleanor vase. It's a 22-inch tall rock crystal vessel with a bejeweled and gilded base and top. It's kind of an enigmatic, mysterious object. Now, we know that the rock crystal originated in Madagascar. And it's clear that the base and the top were made in Egypt or Persia between the 5th and 10th centuries. So what is this object of such foreign exotic provenance doing in the Louvre, and how did it get there? Well, fortunately, we have a clue, a pretty good one too. On it is an inscription in medieval Latin recorded by Suger, who was the abbot of Saint-Denis, the French crown's royal abbey in the 1100s. And this says, "As a bride, Eleanor gave this vase to King Louis, Miradaulis having given it to her grandfather, the king having given it to me, and Suger, which is to say the speaker, having given it to the saints." So let's spend a minute decoding this inscription. First of all, Eleanor is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who died in 1204, legendary duchess who reigned as both Queen of France and Queen of England, and was famous, among other things, for her legendary bare-breasted appearance in the Second Crusade, and for her patronage of troubadours, the poet-bards of southwest France who transformed European literature. Now, this affinity for troubadours was thanks to the grandfather mentioned in the inscription, Duke William IX of Aquitaine, who is often credited as being the first troubadour and whose courtly love poetry was widely admired. Now, how did William IX become a troubadour? Well, this was thanks to his father, William VIII of Aquitaine, who reigned from 1052 to 1086. Now, this is a period that takes us to contemporary Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus. Now, as some of you might know, in this era, Al-Andalus was the site of the Caliphate of Cordoba, an immensely powerful and rich multi-regional empire that collapsed into a civil war in 1009, leaving behind in its wake a cluster of mutually hostile Muslim kingdoms who fought against each other and against their Christian neighbors. This is the era of the so-called Reconquista, the reconquest of the Cid and so on and so forth, right? So the nobility of Christian Spain and France sensed the weakness of Islamic Spain, and they went on the attack. And in 1066, this William VIII, was part of a force that conquered the Muslim town of Barbastro in the north of Spain. Barbastro was plundered by the conquerors, and its inhabitants were enslaved and shipped off to Europe. And among these inhabitants were highly trained slave girl singers that were taken back to the court of Aquitaine, which is how William IX was inspired to develop troubadour poetry by borrowing from Arabic song and verse. Okay, well, let's get back to our inscription. Who is this Mitadaulis? Who gave it to William IX, and why? Well, Mitadaulis was Abd al-Malik Imad ad-Dawla, the last Muslim king of Zaragoza, one of these little kingdoms in Spain. He had been deposed in the year 1110 by a North African group called the Almoravids, who had come over to Spain in the 1080s from Africa and conquered the various petty Muslim kingdoms. Now, what did Imad ad-Dawla do when he was deposed by his fellow Muslims? He took refuge in one of his castles and allied himself with the Christian king, Alfonso I, and took his forces and went into battle with the Christians against the Almoravids, contributing to their defeat at the Battle of Cutanda in 1120. Now, this is important for the vase because who else was at the Battle of Cutanda fighting side by side with Imad ad-Dawla? William IX of Aquitaine. And William IX of Aquitaine and Imad ad-Dawla obviously struck up a friendship, and so Imad ad-Dawla gave him the vase as a gift. Okay, so where did Imad ad-Dawla get the vase? Well, most likely it was part of the treasury. Most likely it was part of the treasury of the Kingdom of Dania. This was another small Muslim kingdom on the Mediterranean coast. And after the fall of the Caliphate, Dania was ruled over by a dynasty of former palace slaves and became a center of piracy and commerce with connections all around the Christian and Muslim Mediterranean. Now, in 1076, Imad ad-Dawla's grandfather, al-Muqtadir, who had recaptured Barbastro in 1067, conquered Muslim Dania and took all its loot and treasure back with him to Zaragoza, including the vase. So how did it get to Dania? And this is where the trail gets colder a little bit. It most likely came from Egypt. Now, in the 10th century, Egypt was the center of the Fatimid Caliphate, a powerful and rich Shia empire which bridged the Mediterranean, Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East. So there are two possibilities. The vase might have been sent as a gift in thanks for food aid provided by the king of Dania to Egypt during a famine, or it might have been taken when the Fatimid palace was looted in the course of a series of military uprisings around the same time. In fact, it's possible that the Fatimids themselves had looted the vase from Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which they briefly conquered and occupied in the 1050s. So the base and top of the vase may have been as old as the 5th century, made under ancient Rome's arch-enemies, the Sassanids. Now, the vase's crystal was probably carved in Egypt, which was not only a premier center for this craft, but was the main terminus of the trade routes that went down the coast of East Africa as far as Mayotte, which is the Isle of Death, from the Arabic Maut, in the Comoros, which is an island just northwest of Madagascar. This is where the crystal would have originated. So the crystal came from Madagascar, was taken by local merchants up to the Isle of Mayotte, and then from there, it plugged into these routes, trade routes that crisscrossed the Indian Ocean trade routes which were used by Muslim and Jewish merchants who established bases not only around the Mediterranean, but also along the African coast, in India, and as far east as Malaysia. So fast forward 500 years, and finally this rock crystal vase is given in 1137 by the newlywed Queen of France to her husband, King Louis VII, who most likely donated it to the Abbot of Saint-Denis as an offering in the hopes that God would show appreciation by having Eleanor bear him a son and heir. Now, as we know, it was not to be. After 13 years of marriage, Eleanor had bore Louis only 2 daughters, and so he had their marriage annulled. She was pretty good with that anyway. She didn't really like him. She had already hooked up with Henry, Duke of Normandy, the arch enemy of King Louis, who went on to become Henry II of England, and for whom Eleanor would produce 2 successors, Richard the Lionhearted, famous for taking on Saladin and losing, and King John, who would be forced to sign the Magna Carta. So in other words, this single object, now in the Louvre, held precious by Fatimid caliphs, Muslim warlords, French troubadours, and ultimately the Queen and King of France, follows a line which shows how deeply connected and integrated this wider world of the West was, and how differences of faith, language, and culture were not necessarily what defined how people thought of themselves or others, or how they discerned beauty or value. We've seen how its journey began in the furthest reaches of the Indian Ocean into a world inhabited by Muslims, Christians, and Jews, accumulating influences perhaps in Zoroastrian Persia, certainly in Shia Egypt, on to Muslim Spain, and finally Christian France, borne along by conflicts among co-religionists and friendships and alliances among infidels, before finally being offered up to God in the vain hopes of bending fate. Now, this is only one example of an object we could look at. We could have looked at, for example, a 12th century trilingual astrolabe with inscriptions in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, a sort of primitive GPS device originating in antiquity and perfected in the Islamic world, used primarily actually to cast horoscopes and ultimately helping pave the way to transoceanic navigation. Or we could look at the coronation robes of King Roger II of Sicily, a Norman king who in the 1100s ruled over a kingdom made up of Muslims, Jews, Byzantine Orthodox, and Latin Christians, whose hand-woven cape, crafted in his royal silkworks, praised his power in Arabic, in this sort of chunky Kufic script. The Arabic-speaking Roger II deliberately embodied at once a Norman warlord, a Byzantine king, and a Muslim sultan. We could have looked at the figure of Alexander the Great, the ancient Macedonian king who remained a figure of legend and awe for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. He even appears in the Quran, and whose legends are probably the most translated and widely read book across the Western world in the Middle Ages. So the Mediterranean, the sea in the middle, was central to the development of Western civilization in the Middle Ages, a Western civilization that emerged out of the integration of Muslims, Christians, and Jews from Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and which manifests itself not only in the Anglo-American world of today, but also in the Islamic world today. And I would just add, as a sort of end note, apropos of the Jaipur Literary Festival and the excellent new book by Willem Dalrymple, that as the Eleanor vase illustrates, crucial elements of what made the West came from beyond its boundaries. And chief among these was the influence of Indian or South Asian culture, which from the time of Alexander the Great decisively contributed to the cultural, scientific, and religious character of the Abrahamic West. We could talk about Barlaam and Jehoshaphat, a story that originated as a Sanskrit life of the Buddha and was adopted into Persian, Arabic, Georgian, Greek, and eventually Latin, and most leading European languages, becoming a worldwide bestseller. Or of how South Asian esotericism shaped Muslim Sufism and Christian and Jewish mysticism. Or how those Arabic numerals that transformed science originated in India. Or how Indian chemistry, metallurgy, and science contributed to the scientific revolution of Islam, which in turn laid the ground for the scientific revolution in Europe. So understanding this historical process of the creation of the West is not an ideological gesture towards diversity. It's a correction of historical or scientific fact. And such corrections aren't always comforting. Darwin's messy account of biological evolution shocked a creationist Europe convinced that white man was formed by God in his image. So the story of the West that myself and my two co-authors, Thomas Berman and Mark Meyerson, show is not one of Christian European triumphalism or of a unique manifest destiny, but of a grand venture in which men and women of diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, and religious cultures all contributed, usually unwittingly and sometimes with the worst of intentions, to the culture that has come in many ways to define our world today. The West belongs to all of us, and that has always been the case. And if nothing else, that might be a good starting point for figuring out how to get along better today. Thank you.
That was a whirlwind tour of a sort of glimpse into this book, which is quite monumental. I'm almost scared to put it into my suitcase lest I have to pay overweight charges. But that object and the way you depicted it was quite fascinating. Not just the provenance and the number of geographical territories that it passed through, but also the fact that it was a product of so many different motive forces. At the beginning, there must have been the motive force of commerce, of manufacture and commerce. At some point, the motive force was plunder. At some point, it was some kind of tribute to a superior king. And at some point in time, it was a tribute to religion. And finally, where it stands now, is a tribute to preservation of history. So one object also encapsulates 6 different forms of transaction between human beings. I found that as fascinating as the geographical provenance.
Well, this is really typical of how culture functions. We have this idea, or we've adopted this idea as well, that there are things called cultures, which are easily defined and clearly defined and very distinct, and which interact with each other and which have boundaries. But in fact, if we look at the way that culture is produced, we see that it always comes from a wide array of different influences. We talk a lot about a cultural appropriation these days as if it's something bad, as if people can own culture, people can plant a flag on culture. But in fact, the history of humanity is the history of cultural appropriation. Now, sometimes that is messy and sometimes it's done with the best intentions, but it's a process in which people continually take the knowledge and experience of other people and reinterpret it, adopt it, and add to it. And I think we can really see this in these objects, which is why I think that looking at objects for a historian is so important. Historians have, our sort of trade is in texts, right? That's what defines our discipline. History is about writing, by definition, right? And that has serious limitations, because if you think about what is written down, right, and what is preserved in a given moment, particularly 1,000 years ago, and it's very expensive to write things down, right? And it's very hard to keep documentation, right? What you get is a representation of only a narrow band, a narrow viewpoint within society. It's often an institutional or official viewpoint that has a certain agenda, right? Particularly in terms of things like Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations, which I study. So, I always tell people that if you want to think about the way texts work as far as history goes, right? Imagine yourself 500 years in the future, right? When, cockroach historians are looking back on the 20th century. And the only thing they have are copies of Fox News reports, right? What kind of history of the United States are they going to write? Illegal immigrants are eating pets. The cities are in flames. People are changing gender at school at lunchtime, right? And that's the picture you'd get if you just looked at these texts. And clearly, we know that living in the United States today, that's not an extremely accurate depiction of our daily lives, right? So these objects, right, which are not explicit in what they communicate like a text is, are really important and really powerful for us to understand the sorts of dynamics that were happening on the ground in ordinary life, and which the people in power weren't necessarily interested in communicating or recognizing, because it didn't reinforce their position of power. Because power often depends on your capacity to divide people and to neutralize their ability to form associations or commonalities that would somehow threaten your agenda of self-preservation and advancement.
Talking about culture, there was a word you used in your other book, Kingdom of Faith, which sort of leapt out of the page at me. It was a word called adab. Now, adab is something which we use in contemporary Hindustani, if not Hindi. And we use it in the sense of a particular form of comportment, of delicacy. But in your book, it has a much larger sort of context. Would you care to talk about it?
Yeah. So adab in the context of Islamic culture and of medieval Spain is this, it's sort of this culture of refinement. The idea that a man, because it's usually a man, but it also applied to women, right? That in order to be a sort of, a full member of society, a member of the elite, one had to not only be, rich and powerful, which is always good, and, have the capacity to kill people, but one also had to be sophisticated. One had to know culture. One had to know music. One had to know how to extemporize poetry. And what's interesting is there were periods in this pre-modern era when this notion of elite comportment, adab in the Islamic context, right, was recognized across all of these traditions as having value. And it provided a bridge for people to communicate with each other. So, for example, we have elite Jews in medieval Spain, right, who are writing poetry in Arabic in order to establish themselves as part of what they see as an elite culture, which, although it's rooted in Islam, actually bridges all of these different religious and cultural traditions. And that provides a vector for them to be able to communicate with each other and collaborate with each other on intimate levels, right? Despite whatever ideological or political differences they might have. And I think this is really important, right? We have to recognize the capacity of people to form associations and affinities with each other that don't have anything to do with their ideological orientation. So you can be a Republican and a Democrat and think the others are terrible people, right? But at the same time, I don't know, you might go to a card night and be playing cards with people, and some of them are Republicans and some are Democrats, and you don't think about them in that context, and you can really be good friends with them and develop relationships that override that.
Or listening to your lecture.
Possibly.
Yeah. I just want to underline that this flow of adab during the first 2.5 centuries of the Umayyad, the first sort of 250-year dynasty that ruled and, in a sense, created Al-Andalus, was a flow from the east to the west.
Yes, for the most part it was. One wants to resist the sort of, we have to resist the notion, because one of the sort of correctives of the historical narrative, particularly we talked about Aristotle, right, and the rediscovery of classic culture. And we talk about like Greek thought being lost and then rediscovered by the Arabs, right, and then picked up by the Christians. And it's almost like people are like passing a football to each other, right? And what we have to remember is that as these processes take place, it's never just a clear linear route, and it's always a process of transformation and creation. So for example, as we saw in the little talk I gave today, we may have that movement, which is sort of, in large terms, we perceive as things moving from east to west, but things are being created and changed all the time.
No, I just wanted to underline that this was largely, and it was encapsulated by this one person you talked about, Blackbird.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about that?
Sure.
I found him a fascinating character.
This is Ziryab. He's one of the sort of notable characters of the sort of narrative of Muslim Spain, and he's a figure that sort of epitomizes how the popular culture of the West came to be shaped by these influences from the Islamic world. So Ziryab, who was his nickname was Ziryab or Blackbird, was an oud player. He was like a guitar player in Abbasid Baghdad in the Golden Age. And, you know, musicians at that time were pretty political. I guess they are today between Kid Rock and Taylor Swift, but more directly politically involved, we might say. And when the Abbasid Caliphate sort of started crumbling and got a little bit dangerous, Ziryab decided he was going to decamp. He was going to leave town. And where was he going to go? Well, luckily, because the whole Western world was connected by this sort of common culture, this Arabo-Islamic inflected common culture, he could find work just about anywhere in the Western world. And he ended up going as far west as Spain. So he went from Baghdad to Spain. And what he did was, when he came to Spain, Islamic Spain at this time, which was kind of a sort of underdeveloped, kind of marginal province of the Islamic world, right? He established himself there. The local ruler was just delighted to have Ziryab there, because he realized that in order to appear to be a strong ruler, you had to be sophisticated. You had to embody this adab. So he gave Ziryab a salary and set him up, gave him a home, whatever he wanted. And Ziryab transformed the culture of Al-Andalus. Right? He changed the way people dressed, the way they wore their hair, the way they played music. He was the one that had brought tablecloths to Al-Andalus. The idea of eating food in different courses, starting with nuts, ending with soup or whatever, right? He brought deodorant, very important development, particularly in the Mediterranean world. Right? And he established this new kind of modern culture in Al-Andalus. So again, we see the interplay between warfare and culture, because as the Christian kingdoms began to conquer Al-Andalus, they recognized the value of this culture and they appropriated it. So all of these things came into European culture through this vector, which originated in Baghdad with influences far beyond, undoubtedly, in South Asia, and eventually ends up being something which seems to characterize the Western world, thanks to this, you know, former slave guitar player of African origin. So
amazing. You know, your both of these books sort of changed the way I look not just at history but also as geography, because being victims, I guess, of Western media, we see the Mediterranean, or I see the Mediterranean largely as being European. And suddenly I see the Mediterranean, and especially Ceuta, as you call it, spelled C-E-U-T-A, as being a natural bridge from Africa into Europe, today used unfortunately by economic migrants, but at that point became like a safety valve for those whose ambition, military ambition, was not fulfilled in Africa and what we call the Far East. But this also raises another issue which you address as a primarily contrarian writer, which is that this was not an Islamic conquest of Spain. It was the natural desire of people with ambition to obtain power. And that is like a very profoundly contrarian stance, because the tendency would be to say this was Islamic conquest of Spain. So could you talk a little bit about that, particularly in the context of this first 250 years of the Umayyad dynasty?
absolutely. Well, let me say first that, you know, we have this kind of, again, it's one of these intellectual prejudices that we develop, where we think of the world as consisting of continents that are these self-contained sort of coherent units. So, you know, if you Google, Europe map or something, right, you'll see this Europe, right, which is like floating in space, detached from everything else. And we tend to think of water as being a barrier of communication and connection. But in fact, historically, water was a connection. And so when we look around this world, particularly when we look at the pre-modern world and we look at something like the Mediterranean, we understand that this is not three continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia, West Asia, that are distinct and disconnected. These are three areas that are intimately connected by the sea and by the land. I mean, you know, when on a clear day, if you are at Gibraltar, you can see Africa, right? So people have been crossing back and forth since prehistory. So the idea that there is this boundary between, historical boundary between Europe and Africa is just wrong. And if we go back to the Roman Empire, which we all like to go back to, you know, there's this notion in some people's imagination that the Roman Empire is European. Well, certainly the city of Rome is what is in now Europe, but all of the good stuff in the Roman Empire, all of the rich parts almost, right, were in North Africa and West Asia. This is where the people was, this is where the resources were, right? This is where Rome looked, right? So the notion of applying these categories of European, African, and Middle Eastern to this period of history is in many contexts, in most contexts, just totally wrong. And it leads us down these kind of slippery paths in which we end up with all these conclusions that don't apply to history.
So I want you to paint a sort of a picture for us. We had 250 years of this Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, and at the end of these 250 years, what would the court of Cordoba have looked like? Would it have been entirely of people of Arabic origin, speaking entirely in Arabic, and only of the Muslim faith? What would it have looked like?
Well, an interesting thing happened, right? So one of the sort of particular things about Islamic culture in the pre-modern area, and this kind of sets it apart from Christianity and Judaism, is that on an ideological level, Islam recognizes the legitimacy of Christianity and Judaism as religions. It doesn't regard them as being correct, but they're kind of acceptable because, you know, their intentions are good and they've got, you know, a lot right. And so Christians and Jews could be legitimate subjects and had a sort of constitutional right to be legitimate subjects in Islamic societies. They had a position in law. It was a secondary position, right? But it was a position in law, right? So that meant that Christian and Jewish populations and societies not only survived but throve in the Islamic world. And you can see that, you know, tragically today, and I say tragically because the events in the Middle East in the last 20 years have brought to our attention all sorts of these little kind of religious minorities that we've never heard of, the Yazidis, right, and things like that. And these little particular religious minorities were able to survive for 1,500 years under Islamic rule, right, because in theory, it's not always true in application, right, Islam recognizes the right of these communities to exist. So although, getting back to Islamic Spain, although Islamic Spain was this Islamic empire, right, based at Cordoba, it was an empire that was very much made up of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Now we get to politics, right? And politics were a thing that helped sustain these Christian and Jewish populations. Why? Because if you're in power, what you want to do is you want to divide and rule. And if you're in power, the people who are most a threat to you are not outsiders, but they're the people within your own group because they have the potential to overthrow you and challenge you. So the policy in a lot of these Muslim kingdoms in the Middle Ages was actually to empower Jewish and Christian communities to act as a political counterbalance to possible Muslim descent within their own kingdoms. It's kind of like if you want to look at a modern analogy, you can look at the Syria of today, right, which is under the Assad family. The Assad family are Alawites, which is a minority Muslim faith which is considered heretical by mainline Muslims. This is why the Assad dynasty in Syria, they empower the Christians of Syria because they can use them as a counterbalance to mainline Muslims who might resist them and want to overthrow them. Now, is that tolerance, which we like to talk about in terms of intercommunal relations in the Middle Ages? I don't know if it's tolerance or not, right? But for those Christians in particular, it's a better situation for them perhaps, right? Whatever the intentions of the regime are. So, you know, we got to be careful not to romanticize this.
Fascinating. I think it's time we throw the floor open to questions. I think mics will be on the ready. So if you have a question,
Mics
please
are on the ready.
We have one from the gentleman at the back.
Yes, I'll bring that back. Just a note, please hold the microphone a little close to your head instead of over here, because then we can't hear you. Also, try to frame your question as a question and not as a comment or reaction. So that way we get more questions and answers in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was hoping if you could please elaborate on the paradigm of the Eastern world and the Western world in relation to how it is used for geopolitical interests and corporate interests. And you see a lot of things like even modern day conflicts. You see people that are from the very same place in conflict and the two different sides being framed as a Western side and an Eastern side, and you see things being manipulated in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think we have that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it. If you're going to use categories like Eastern and Western, and that was the sort of object of the game we played at the beginning, think about why you're using them or why you're deploying them. You know, for me, in that game, there's no right and wrong answer, but I think it's more right to call all three, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, either Eastern or Western, because they're essentially the same with a few minor differences. So what happens is that these categories, unless we constantly test ourselves on what we mean by our analytical categories, right, we engage in all kinds of slippage, right? And we use these terms loosely in a sort of floating way that doesn't really have any connection. And then the problem is then we start making assumptions based on this. We say, well, these are Eastern people, so they think this way, or they're going to do this, or we're different from them because of that. So I think that getting back to your question, I think the problem is that these categories are often used in a really sloppy way. So when I use them for my work, I stake out what I mean. And for me, the West is this larger cultural sphere which is essentially characterized by these Abrahamic faiths in the pre-modern period, which are all pretty much on the same page in terms of the way they think about the world, God, law, and all these other things. And that's what makes sense to me. To someone else, it might not, or if they're asking a different question, then East and West can mean something different, because they're kind of floating signifiers. You fill them in as you want.
Thank you for your lecture or your 20-minute talk, and also for the moderation. With the massive immigration into Europe and the massive migration from South America, Central America into the U.S., where does this idea of sameness become part of our conversation in the U.S. or in Western Europe? Because there seems to we continue down this path of separation.
Well, I'm a medieval historian, so don't draw me into contemporary politics, particularly not when this is going on YouTube. So I would just say that, there's all kinds of things at work, and, commonality will get you so far, but what we're talking about also is we're talking about perceived economic competition. We're talking about the political use of migration. We're talking about people's anxieties about what they consider their own language and culture. And so, all of these things are bound up into these complex problems. But I think, the baseline, and, this is true for anybody. I mean, I fundamentally believe that, as human beings, we share more than we differ. We're all prisoners of our body, and our bodies haven't changed that much in the last, 100,000 years, right? And they pretty much predicate or dictate or shape what our desires, fears, and ambitions are. So generally speaking, I think, we have a lot more in common than we differ, right? But that only gets you so far.
So may I turn that question around and ask you whether, in your view, medieval or Al-Andalus would have been more tolerant of the immigrant than contemporary US or Western Europe is?
Well, not necessarily. You know, what brought down, going back to this Caliphate of Cordoba, one of the things that brought it down was that there was a political movement, right, among the rulers to try to sideline the native elite, right? It was very powerful. And the way they did that was they brought in people from North Africa in increasing numbers. And they incorporated them into the army, and they incorporated them into the political structure. And it got to a point where the native elite was all of a sudden, wait a minute, we're losing power here, right? It wasn't a Christian-Muslim thing, because they were all Muslims, right? We're losing power here. And those North Africans, they're not like us Arabs, even though the Christians, or the Muslims in Spain were really Arabs, right? They're not like us Arabs, right? They're uncivilized, you know, uncouth, dirty, nasty kind of thing, right? And so we can see that these ethnic tensions can bubble up, and I think they come up as a consequence of things like political competition, economic competition, and the perceived loss of status. And I think you don't have to look very far to see that today, right? The notion that your status is somehow, whatever it was, is being compromised by these people that are coming over, right? That invites a really powerful and visceral reaction, right? So again, this is something which we see throughout history.
Do we have any other questions? Because I have a few. Okay, the lady here.
So I have a Columbus question. So I attended a lecture at the University of Colorado in the Judaic Studies from a professor at Iowa who had a theory, well, I think it's more than a theory. I can't find it, by the way, online right now, that Columbus approached Isabella because he followed a mystic, an Italian mystic, who predicted that the second coming was going to happen at the millennium, 1500. And the most pure place is where he would show up. And that was the reason of the Inquisition, and that was the reason for the 1492 expedition. Have you heard that?
That particular one is a new one on me, I have to admit. Could be, but probably not. Usually, these monumental historical processes don't happen because of one thing. And certainly, the Inquisition had very different roots from that. And, you know, whether it was Columbus or not, that ocean was going to be crossed, and pretty soon. Because at bottom, Europeans wanted to get at that stuff that was in East Asia, and they were tired of having to go through all these Islamic intermediaries. And to more than one of them who knew, everyone knew the earth was a sphere, that maybe they could go the other way. So a lot of these things, these rationalizations are kind of invented afterward to kind of dress things up, or in retrospect, or with 20/20 hindsight, in order to sort of create a narrative, right? And we have to be careful not for mistaking those narratives that are created afterwards, right, for the actual reasons that things happened, you know. Even today, when a politician does something, it's not necessarily because of why they say they're doing it. Quite often the opposite.
So,
Yes, thank you. I was hoping that you could talk about, you were saying there's this Eastern-Western dichotomy, and you had us all at the beginning think about what we associate with. Where did that come from, and when did it start as kind of a cultural artifact that we started thinking about the world as Eastern and Western?
thank you.
Well, that's a great question, and somewhat beyond my remit, right? One of the things is, you know, again, it's one of these concepts that changes over time. We could go back to the classical era, right? And we might have the Romans talking about the Persians in the context of East and West, or the Greeks, right, in the context of East and West, right? And this idea sort of persists, but it changes over time, so that when we get to, you know, the 18th century, the 19th century age of colonialism, or the modern age, this idea of the Orient or the East, and the East versus West, it's not necessarily the same as it was back then, even though the same sort of vocabulary might be used. It's kind of like, we think about democracy. When did democracy start? Well, democracy was started by the ancient Greeks in Athens. Yeah, but what was it? Right? A city in which most people were slaves, in which only free men could vote and women couldn't vote. So is that really democracy? It's got the same name, but is it the same thing? So it's really hard to say when these paradigms were started, because they're kind of moving targets. Right? Kind of like I was getting at before when we were talking about East and West. They're signifiers which are almost empty, and so they can be constantly deployed and changed, even using the same vocabulary.
We have barely time for a last question here.
Okay, this is. All right, that was fascinating, thank you. It's a trivial question, but the signifier Muslim, I was brought up in South Asia, India, to describe that community as Muslim. I hear you using Muslim or some other pronunciation. How did this traverse the different ways to describe this community? Thank you.
Well, you say potato, I say potato.
Tomato. Well, that was most enlightening. Thank you so much, Brian, for packing so much into this 1 hour.
Thank you very much.